Grab your Bible and head over to Judges 7. That's where our reading this week in Judges chapter 7. And we're really just continuing Gideon's story that we began reading last week. In fact, I want to continue to encourage you to read through. What did we decide? Do about chapter 9?
Yeah, if we're going to put Abimelech in as kind of the end of the Gideon story.
Yeah, 6 through 9 will kind of give you the whole picture of Gideon. But if you wanted to sort of outline this, maybe Jeff will even like the chapter break here. We do move from 6 to sort of the setup to 7.
Seven's the story we all remember Gideon for. This is the classic kids' Bible class story.
Well, it's the actual deliverance from the enemies. And probably most noted because of the bizarre, first the bizarre selection process for a force, and then secondly the bizarre battle strategy that they employ. But sometimes we sort of mess around with that and miss kind of the deeper part that's under all of that. God is the one who says in chapter 7 that I want Israel to know that they didn't do this, but that I did. And so it seems to me everything going on in chapter 7 is about persuading the nation to recognize God and put their trust in him.
Right. And the fact that, human means, human ways, and the things that we tend to be afraid of or respect or hold in honor, or take note of, is not how God looks at the world. And so, everything from the minimal number of men he actually used to, as you put it, kind of the bizarre and counterintuitive battle strategy. Basically using, today we say flashlights and Tupperware. I mean, basically, pictures and torches, and with that, running the enemy out, and there's and they lose, a lot of people. I mean, in the kings themselves. I mean, just the whole thing is a debacle for Midian. And it's done in the way that truly emphasizes is the Lord's doing.
Well, and it's not even that's just hinted at by the nature of the way that they do that. Later in the story, as the battle is raging, it says that God turned their swords against each other.
Right.
So God's literally in the middle of this, messing with the enemy, to be sure of the outcome of this battle.
That's right. No, that's exactly right.
So that it's crystal clear, I'm doing this for you.
Right.
And no one's going to, there's no way Israel walks away and says, by the strength of our power, we have conquered Midian.
Well, and that's why you even think about, the shout that's given is for the Lord and for Gideon. I mean, there is this kind of this acknowledgement of God's doing and God's involvement in this, even in the way that they, announce their presence, if you will, as they blow their trumpets and do their thing and give this great yell.
I think traditionally Gideon is seen as a hero in the story.
Yeah.
But as we've seen in chapter 6, even when we get to chapter 7, there continues to be this fearfulness.
Yeah,
about him.
Again, we just, typically, again, the kind of the VBS version of the story, we just focus on, the way God, we focus on God's role, rightly so, and the unique things that God does with the 300 and with the battle implements, such as they are, the weapons he sends them into war with, as it were. But there is this episode that's often easily overlooked, which is God having Midian go down and kind of sneak, up to the Midianite camp there to overhear what's going on. But verse 11 of this chapter, God explains why he has Gideon do that. And God says to Gideon, and you shall hear what they say, and afterward your hand will be strengthened to go down against the camp. And so we, in chapter 6, when we first meet Gideon, he's the guy who's fearful to tear down Baal's altar, except by night. And, text emphasizing, he does it by night because of fear. Then he needs the fleece, the whole thing with the fleece and the reassurances from God that God is really with him. And now, even after all of that, after God, successfully defends him, even though he does it at night, they want to kill him for destroying the altar of Baal in chapter 6. And God, providentially, nothing happens to Gideon. And then the fleece reassurances. And yet here, it's almost, God kind of saying, I know, Gideon, you still need some reassurance. And so go down and hear how the Midianites themselves have had this ominous dream. That they themselves are a little unnerved. As a way of kind of building Gideon's confidence. There is this kind of this thread of fear and doubt that sits in Gideon's mind, apparently.
Well, and it, in some ways, he kind of represents the nation itself, particularly the failure of the nation to put their trust in God.
Right.
Because all along, even in the presence of the deliverer, you mentioned this last week, they're still struggling with the idolatry.
Well, yeah, I mean that was part of chapter 6, right? Too. They're suffering Midianite oppression. They're crying out to God for deliverance, and yet when God wants to deal with the sin before He offers them the solution of getting rid of the Midianites, He went by having Baal's altar torn down. They're angry.
Right.
They're angry at Gideon for doing this, wanting to kill him over it. And so, we just like us today, we want God's salvation, but we really don't want to deal with the sin issue first. And that's kind of the interesting thing about us. We don't really want to clean up our lives. We just want God to bail us out. And so, this sits in the character of the people. And obviously, as the book keeps going, and we'll see, the people themselves are less and less noble. And so you have this duplicity here, and God calls them out for that.
Yeah. It's a shame we're not going to get this till later, because I think it's factoring into the stories here. But the theme, especially at the back end of the book, is there was no king in Israel, and that's the problem here. They want a rescuer, but they don't want a king.
Right.
Right. They don't want someone to whom they have to bow the knee and do what he said. And I think the language of the book is not really so much political language as spiritual language. That there should have been a king in Israel, not a guy sitting on a throne in a palace somewhere, but Jehovah should have been their king, and they should have put their trust in him. And it seems to me that one of the purposes, especially in chapter 7, and the way the story lays out, is to say, I am worthy of your trust. You can put your trust in me.
Right.
You need to make me your king, and yet all along the way, Gideon, who kind of represents the nation, has to be drug along. It's a little bit like Barak that way, has to be drug along because he's afraid.
But, and of course, what's interesting, too, in some ways about this is, one of the things that we see, if you look at the judges' stories as far as both the quality of the judges and the integrity of the people continues to disintegrate, as it were.
Your downward spiral.
The downward spiral. God's deliverances tend to become more spectacular and public and truly emphasize, to your point, his trustworthiness. Othniel was relatively brief. Ehud was relatively private. Just kind of kill. Ehud delivers by killing Eglon. In a private way. Deborah and Barak is an open battle, but there's not. But there's not, the Lord delivers, but it's not really told how. This story is the time where, truly something unique. It's not Barak leading a big army out the battle. The whole point of this time is don't take a big army. Let's whittle this down to 300 and use, no swords, no shields. Do something truly to emphasize God's, so again, God's unique ways of delivering are getting more and more, hey guys, I've got this. If you stick with me, you have nothing to worry about. I can do this with one hand tied behind my back if God had hands, so to speak. This is not a big deal for God. And so God's deliverances are beginning to emphasize more and more. Why aren't you trusting me yet? Why aren't you staying faithful to me yet?
Yeah. Isn't that a remarkable testimony to his patience?
Yeah.
That he would still, after all this time, be working with them. Because this wasn't, something that happened over 30 years. This is literally happening over hundreds of years. And in fact, I don't know how well we could line this up generationally. But, it's like generation after generation gets a crisis and a judge and a deliverance from God. And so one after another gets an opportunity to see the hand of the Lord and to put their trust in him. And one after another just rejects that offer. Right. And as they do, just gets worse and worse and worse.
Absolutely. Nope, that's exactly right.
So a good opportunity, we've been thinking about kids through all of this, to help kids get beyond just the VBS story and to see some of the deeper lessons here. Surely one of them is, I don't think it's primary lesson, but surely one of the lessons is that God doesn't need all the stuff to give victory, right? He doesn't need, in this case, the army and the swords and all of those things to win the battle.
Yeah.
God can win the battle. God can win that battle without any of the physical military stuff. And so as a parallel to our own struggles today, especially to say to young people, with God on your side, you don't have to worry about who the adversary is, who's on the other side pushing on you or tempting you or whatever. You are a superior force when you stand with God.
And the way that we have to work in the world is not the way that God has to work in the world.
Right.
You know, you and I, humanly speaking, might need the sword and the shield. God just doesn't. So we got to quit thinking that God is like us and therefore limited in the ways that we would be in difficult situations.
Yeah, and then obviously the other thing is that He has earned our trust. He has demonstrated that He is trustworthy, and unlike the people of that day, we need to be sure that we do have a king in our life. So there are some thoughts to ponder as you work in chapter 7 this week.